All right. So thanks everyone who's here live or listening later last week or in the last video, depending on how you were watching. We started reading the book of Romans. We read through chapter 1, and it was this sort of treatise on knowledge and sin that was sort of outwardly kind of directed at the Gentile world largely. That the flow of the argument is that God has given all people, including the Gentiles, the pagans, enough knowledge of himself to know better than that they are doing. So while they might not have enough to really know God the way that Israel with the Torah knows God, they have enough to do better than they're doing right now. That God has given the Gentiles, the pagans, however your translation might put it, a little bit of knowledge, and they have rejected the little bit that they've gotten. And we said that it is kind of standard language at this time for a sort of Jewish polemic against the Greco-Roman and just sort of wider pagan world. A sort of catalog of the sins of these people, their rejection of God. But what happens in chapter 2 is turning this a little bit, as we anticipated last week. So last week we talked a lot about they, or Paul did. They do this, they do that, they do this. Kind of speaking, even though it's a mixed church, from the perspective of a Jewish Christian. But now Paul's going to turn inward. And so we're going to talk about that now, as we note from the very first verse of this chapter. They becomes you, and things get a little bit more personal. So we'll read. Therefore, you have no excuse, whoever you are, when you judge others. For in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, are doing the very same things. You say, we know that God's judgment is on those who do such things in accordance with truth. Do you imagine, whoever you are, that when you judge those who do such things and yet do them yourself, that you will escape the judgment of God? Or do you despise the riches of his kindness and forbearance and patience? Do you not realize that God's kindness is meant to lead you to repentance? But by your hard and impenitent heart, you are storing up wrath for yourself on the day of wrath, when God's righteous judgment will be revealed. For he will repay according to each one's good deeds. To those who by patiently doing good seek glory and honor and immortality, he will give eternal life. While for those who are self-seeking and who obey not the truth, but wickedness, there will be wrath and fury. So, like I said, we have this switch from the Gentiles, the pagans, they're doing this, to now. So if they're doing that, why do you not see it as a problem when you do the same thing? It becomes a discussion of hypocrisy, and it's not directed at any one particular person or group. He's speaking as a Jewish person to Jews, presumably here, as we're going to see. But he's talking kind of more broadly about what he sees as Israel's bigger failure, that Israel has given in and started acting in the same way as the Gentiles, because even though they have God's law, they don't think they actually need to follow it, or they don't act like they need to follow it. Amos and I were talking before this started that I'm doing some writing on the book of Jeremiah right now, and this is one of the major themes in Jeremiah, that the people are treating God and the temple as almost like a good luck charm, that as long as we have this, we're safe. We know we're God's chosen people because we have the temple. We have, for better or worse, God contained in this space, so we'll be fine. Jeremiah is always telling the people, no, that's not how it works. God's not a good luck charm that you possess. God is a partner in a covenant relationship that you're failing in. And Paul is very much mirroring that kind of language now, when he's sort of speaking to his own people, saying, we have God's truth, but by and large, we're not doing much better than the Gentiles are of reflecting it. We might have the law and knowledge of God, but kind of like the people in Jeremiah's, they were treating that more like a sort of good luck charm or an inherent thing where we're safe because we have this. Michael Bird, in his commentary, refers to this section as the hypocritical teacher, and I think that's a good way to put it. A big theme throughout all of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, is that Israel is meant to be an example to the Gentiles, that they are supposed to be this people who God has given special knowledge to so that they can form themselves and become the types of people who teach the whole world about God and God's character and what God requires of them. But Paul is saying, by and large, they failed to do that. And so he says, like we got here, do you imagine, whoever you are, that when you judge people for doing things you do, that you won't also be judged by God? Hypocrisy is the problem here. And what Paul is trying to point out is that a couple things. He says that they've mistaken patience with acceptance, that they see God not punishing them immediately for their wrongdoing, and they think God kind of doesn't care what we do. We're the special people. But he's saying you've just mistaken the fact that God is patient and giving you lots of time to repent. God doesn't accept, but God is patient, and you're confusing those two things. And he even moves on to say, even though God might have a special relationship with Israel, with the Jewish people, God is still, to quote another part of the Bible, not a respecter of person. God shows impartiality in judgment. And that's where it gets at the end, and even a couple of verses after, when he said in 9, there will be distress and anguish for everyone who does evil, the Jew first and also the Greek. But glory and honor and peace to everyone who does good, the Jew first and also the Greek. For God shows no partiality. So he set this up that God's judgment on the world, on people, won't take into account their ethnicity or their being in Israel or their being a Gentile. God shows no partiality. And it kind of brings up the question of, okay, then what's the point of having this special knowledge that the Jewish people here have? And so we'll go on and talk about that for a little bit. But the bigger point not to miss here is that he's setting up a standard that all people have a standard that they need to meet to be in accordance with God's will. The Jews aren't exempt or automatically meeting that standard by virtue of being Jews, any more than the Gentiles are. And when God comes to judge the world, God will judge the Jew by the same standard as the Greek or the Gentile or the pagan. So he goes on to 12 to say, okay, so kind of what is the point of being in Israel, being Jewish? He's going to come several times to this in this letter. And so he goes in through 12. All who have sinned apart from the law will also perish apart from the law. And all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous in God's sight, but the doers of the law who will be justified. When Gentiles, who do not possess the law, do instinctively what the law requires, these, though not having the law, are a law to themselves. They show that what the law requires is written on their hearts, to which their own conscience also bears witness. And their conflicting thoughts will accuse or perhaps excuse them on the day when, according to my gospel, God through Jesus Christ will judge the secret thoughts of all. So the Jews say, speaking carefully, Paul is saying these Jewish people, whoever he's talking about, are saying to themselves that because we have the law, we're sort of better and safe. And he says, no, the law is a standard, just like the Gentiles have the standard and the law written on their hearts. So if you have the law and you don't follow the law, you're not doing any better than a Gentile who has the law on their heart we talked about last time, but isn't following that. And then kind of, to add insult to injury, he kind of puts this in reverse, that if you have a Gentile who's doing God's will because he has this law of God on his heart, that person is doing better than a Jewish person who actually has the law, the Torah, but isn't following it. Again, God is not going to be partial in judgment. The Jewish people, Paul is saying, might have a particular mission to the world, but that doesn't mean that they're exempt from having a standard that they have to meet. And so he goes on in 17. But you who call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast of your relation to God and know his will and determine what is best because you were instructed in the law. And if you are sure that you are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, a corrector of the foolish and a teacher of children, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth, you then that teach others, will you not teach yourself? While you preach against stealing, do you steal? You that forbid adultery, do you commit adultery? You that abhor idols, do you rob temples? You that boast in the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? For as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. So he's extending on here to keep saying that, again, the law is not a good luck charm for Israel. It's not a get out of jail free card for them. It's something that's meant to help them guide the Gentiles and guide the nations around them. But he says the teachers have become hypocritical. You know, he has this sling of rhetorical questions that the way he's setting up, the answer is yes or no, depending on how you're setting it up, right? The people saying not to steal are stealing. The people saying not to commit adultery are committing adultery. And he puts it more directly. You boast about the law and your special relationship to God, but you don't follow it. You dishonor God and you break the law. And because of that, he says Israel is not accomplishing its mission to the world that's set up in, you know, all the way back in the book of Genesis and repeated so often in the Hebrew Bible in the Old Testament. So he's going to continue on in 25 to keep this point up, that knowledge isn't enough. It's not enough to know the law, and that the Jews might know the law much better than the Gentiles do, who may have this vague idea because God has put it on their hearts. But knowing the law is not enough. You need to do the law also. And he's saying, by and large, they're not doing this. And so he's going to continue to go on and just kind of deconstruct this idea of a sort of inherited superior status. And so he says in 25, circumcision indeed is of value if you obey the law, but if you break the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. So if those who are uncircumcised keep the requirements of the law, will not their uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? Then those who are physically uncircumcised but keep the law will condemn you that have written the code and circumcision but break who have the written code and circumcision but break the law. For a person is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is true circumcision something external and physical. Rather, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and real circumcision is a matter of the heart. It is spiritual and not literal. Such a person receives praise not from others, but from God. So he brings back here to talk about circumcision, which you probably know is the sign of the covenant for Israel. That this is given to them very early on in their history, if I'm not mistaken in my timeline, before the actual law itself. And this is what sets God's people apart. This is a sign they practice. But he says again, it's a sign that you're a people committed to acting a certain way about God and living in a certain relationship to God. It's not a magic ritual that sets you up to get out of judgment like some of you were treating it. It's a sign that you're going to act a certain way, but if you're not acting that way, the sign doesn't do anything for you, because the thing that really matters, he says, is internal. That funny phrase that we're just going to have to get used to hearing in Romans several times, the circumcision of the heart, or the inward circumcision, where he's saying still, this is good. God gave this people this sign for this reason, but it's only a sign. It points to a spiritual internal reality, and that internal reality is more important than the external sign that points towards it. And so if you have the sign but not that inner reality, if you have the sign showing that you're obedient but you're not being obedient, the sign doesn't point to anything. It doesn't mean anything. And in the same way, it goes in reverse. If you don't have that external sign but you are being faithful and obedient, well, the lack of the sign there doesn't really matter because the internal reality is there. That's how he's setting this up. So again, he ends with this note that Israel likes to think of itself as a judge of the Gentile and the pagan world, but they're doing the same things. They're not a righteous judge as they do them. They're a hypocritical judge. Israel has the law, but it's failed to honor God in the same way that the Gentiles who have the law partially in their hearts have also failed to honor God. And so we end the chapter with this sort of bleak picture where we look at both groups, the Gentiles and the Jews, and neither one of them as a group are doing what they need to be doing. Paul's not afraid of talking about good examples here and there that we should look at, the people that do or keep the law. But by and large, on the sort of scale of the human problem, we just aren't making the cut on either side. And the thing he's going to set up here, and that he'll really start to kind of put his thesis down in the next chapter, is that the Jews need Christ as much as the Gentiles do. And we talked about some of the reasons that there were tensions in the Roman church between the Gentile Christians and the Jewish Christians. And the first thing that Paul's going to do to try and mend this gap is remind them why they both need Christ. They don't have different spiritual needs and are trying to find a way to meet them in the same space. They have the same spiritual need. And we're going to get to that in 3. The point isn't that Gentiles are bad. The point isn't that the Jewish people are bad. The point isn't that Gentiles are the worst sinners ever. The point isn't that the Jewish people are the worst sinners ever. The point is that humans are just not in the right state with God apart from Christ, and that's what Christ's work is going to do, is to reconcile and repair that relationship. And we'll get into that kind of state more directly next week. Before we end tonight, just a note I wanted to make on kind of applying this out. As we read the book of Romans, a lot of it's going to be thinking about the Jewish people and how they relate to the gospel. And that happens for a few reasons. One, like we said, is that this is a mixed church where you've got populations of Jewish and Gentile Christians, and Paul's trying to help them figure out how to relate to one another. But also because for Paul, it's weird, theologically speaking, that more of Israel hasn't accepted the Messiah. And so for Paul, he almost, not like Paul's afraid, but Paul almost sees that the failure of Israel to recognize the Messiah might be a thing that makes some people wonder, well, then was Jesus even the Messiah if his own people didn't seem to recognize and think that? And so we're going to see that pop up and him start to think about Jesus' relationship to Israel throughout the book. But as we do that, I do think it's important to kind of state outright that I don't think that anywhere in this letter, especially in this letter, but even in the rest of the New Testament, I don't think it's ever really right to say that the church or Christianity is ever said to be replacing Judaism or the Jewish people. And Paul's going to be pretty explicit in this letter that what's happening is not a replacement of one group by another, but a grafting is what he's going to call it later on, right? Like the Gentiles are added on to what Israel has already been doing. So sometimes when we're reading Romans, and just in the way that people will teach and preach and read Romans, it can be tempting to, whenever you see Israel, the Jewish people, think church, and when you see, Gentiles or pagan or whatever, think non-believers. I don't always think that's a really good comparison to make, but that doesn't mean that we can't learn something from the mistakes of Israel that Paul is talking about here. Because the problem that Paul sees in Israel is still very much one that we have a problem with, and that's pride and hypocrisy. Israel's problem, Paul is ultimately saying in this chapter, is that they think that they have something to offer others that they don't themselves also need just as much. And so I think that's kind of, if we're going to take chapter 2, which is this one part of this much bigger argument, and try and draw any sort of kind of spiritual lesson out of it, I think that's the big one. The church doesn't replace Israel, but we can learn from them. And Paul is saying here that when we're thinking about our mission as people that follow God, we have to always avoid the trap of thinking that we're giving something to others that we don't also need, not just have needed in the past, but still need just as much. And that need, of course, is Christ, and he's going to set that up in the next chapter. But I wanted to end with that note here. So thank you all for being here. I'm looking forward to chapter 3, where this all sorts of ties together and starts moving into kind of a happier place for the book. But for now, we'll stop the recording, and then for those of you that are here, we'll do discussion and questions.